I remember when I first played StarCraft 2, I was really disappointed by it. Wings of Liberty, I felt, was very meh. It didn't really live up to the original, at least in terms of story and tone. I do, in general, much prefer the gameplay of the second game, largely just because it's more modern. I find the missions more kind of complex and cinematic. The difficulty's a lot more even, and I'm not very good at RTSs, so it was kind of nice for me that the game was a bit more accessible overall. But I remember at the time just thinking, it wasn't very good. Heart of the Swarm was very similar. I enjoyed it a lot in terms of its gameplay, but the story made me really angry, and I did a whole video ranting about it. And Legacy of the Void, I've just never been the biggest fan of the Protoss campaign, so I didn't get very far in that, and I just kind of gave up. So I've come back to it about a decade since I first played Heart of the Swarm, and I figured, you know what, I'm on an RTS binge. Let's give StarCraft 2 another go. Let's go through. I'll replay all three campaigns. I never actually finished Legacy of the Void, so we're just going to go through them. This time I actually started with Heart of the Swarm for some reason, and I had the same problems I had with it the first time, but I did enjoy the gameplay a lot. And then I actually played Legacy of the Void second, and I'll do a separate video talking about Legacy of the Void. But in kind of a strange fashion, the last campaign I replayed was Wings of Liberty. And I remember the first time playing this, I thought it was very different than the original, disappointingly so. Like, the space opera elements were gone, all the grim darkness and backstabbing and all the other things I liked about the original were just kind of not present. And replaying it, to be honest, that's not really the case at all. I think this mostly lives up to the original. At least Wings of Liberty does. I don't think it's really that tonally different. It's taken me a while to try to figure out why it feels tonally different and it feels so different. I think it's mostly just because of the way they changed the storytelling from the briefing screens to the cinematics. And the cinematics just give you access to a lot more different stuff than the briefing screens did. Like, you're in the sense that it's not purely in the briefing screen. Like, you have them in the cantina, you have news reports, you can see what's happening in other parts of the Kaprulu sector. It's just a lot more open, and you see a lot more stuff like body language and other ways that the characters interact. And I think in general, it just feels a little bit odd given the first game and how it was entirely done in briefing screens. I mean, imagine if you did a Command and Conquer game and you went from having the cinematics at the beginning and sometimes the end of the mission to having, like, kind of a more open thing where you have stuff in between missions and you have cinematics that aren't directly related and stuff like that. So my point is, I don't think it's really that tonally different or that much inferior in terms of writing or anything. I think they just changed because they kind of had to how they told the narrative in a significant way, and that just kind of takes some getting used to. But if you put all that aside, the difference is this is very much a Terran campaign, I think of a similar quality to the previous two ones. Of the three races, I've always liked the Terran campaign the most, by a significant margin. Not necessarily even that I prefer Terran as a race to play as, but the campaign tends to be the most down-to-earth because you're dealing with humans, so you're dealing with stuff like military matters, with different states fighting each other, with backstabbing and betrayal, with very kind of conventional politics and conventional political ideologies. And nothing against the Zerg or Protoss, but I just like that style of storytelling more. The Zerg campaigns were interesting in that they were from a completely alien perspective. While the Protoss are also aliens, they tend to have fairly human-like moralities and personalities, even if they're a bit weird. Whereas the Zerg are completely unhuman and come from a completely different perspective. So the way I kind of viewed it is the Terran campaign was kind of down to earth and the nitty-gritty. The Zerg campaign was from a completely alien perspective, And the Protoss campaign focused on the meta plot. Like what was going on with the Zelnaga, what's going on with the Mun, what's going on kind of at the galaxy scale. And it was kind of very well separated between the three. And I think the Wings of Liberty does that well. For the most part, it just focuses on Jim Raynor's struggle against the Terran Dominion. As the title suggests, very much the theme of liberty versus tyranny, which has always kind of been the basis of the various Terran campaigns and kind of the Terran species in general as it appears in Starcraft. Because you go through periods where you have revolutionary groups who want to bring about freedom, but you also will have authoritarian or totalitarian governments. Like you have the UED, you have the Terran Confederacy, you have the Dominion under Arcturus Manx, but you also have the initial Sons of Korhal, Reynard's Raiders, the Emojins, and various other Terrans who tend to have a more preference for freedom. And I think that this campaign does a good job of that, where you have kind of the rough around the edges people like Jim and Tycho and kind of some of the other guys who really are kind of rednecks from the back world. But then you also have kind of the more clean-cut, polished guys like Valerian Minx and Matthew Horner. And I think it does do a very good job from kind of an aesthetic and cultural perspective of showing the big divide between the wealthy, sophisticated core worlds and kind of the backwater that a lot of the other planets are, that receive basically no attention and no resources. And it's very much the way the first game went. I think that's deliberate, as they tried to make this as much like the first game as possible for the three campaigns, because I think given how much time had passed and what the expectations were like, they were probably very worried that this was just not going to sit well with the StarCraft fan base. On the whole, though, I would say that Jim's back and he's mostly in character. He's very clearly the same person that we met in StarCraft. Arcturus Minx is back and he's very much the same person we met in the original StarCraft. Kerrigan in this game, at least, I thought was pretty similar to the Queen of Blades in the original StarCraft. And I think they did a good job with the new characters of rounding out the cast. Matthew Horner reminds me a bit of what... Jim was already a bit cynical and jaded when we first met him in StarCraft 1, but he kind of feels like what a younger Jim Raynor might have been before he was even cynical and jaded in the first game. He is kind of this younger, more idealistic, clean-cut guy who really does believe he could make the difference. And it is kind of nice for him to be there and to kind of be, I don't know if you'd call him Jim's morality pet, but just someone who unconditionally believes in Jim, who thinks that he's a good man, and thinks that he still has some fight in him. It's also kind of interesting to kind of compare him to the other guys, because he's not like a criminal or really an outlaw. He was a Dominion officer who defected for moral reasons. And he's still a professional soldier, which makes him kind of interesting to contrast with a lot of the other raiders. Tycho, I thought, was a really good addition, because we always see like Marines in cutscenes or something, but it's kind of nice to have one as a major character who's always around to say something sarcastic or to kind of be a bit more of like the, I don't know if you want to call him like the redneck or whatever, but he's just a great deal of fun and he brings in some much needed comic relief. Finally, I also like Valerian a lot, because in this game at least he's very mysterious. We don't know if he's going to be like his father or if he's going to be more like Matt Horner or a bit more like Jim, like where he's going to fall in terms of his morality, because he is a very sophisticated, well-educated, elegant man, but at the same time he's running all these ops behind the scenes to try to take down his father. So you don't really know which direction he's going to go, and that's kind of an interesting character arc that we don't really see play out fully until the end of Heart of the Swarm. I do think they did a good job of capturing the idea that Reynard's Raiders are outlaws and they're fighting kind of a covert guerrilla war against the government. I think there's kind of a lot of interesting missions where you raid stuff from the Dominion. The idea of having a clip from the first game of Menks ranting about how he was calling down the Zerg, I thought was actually a rather brilliant and kind of fun way of referencing the first game, but not in a gratuitous way. And it was kind of fun, like you had to take over the broadcast stations to broadcast the clip of Manx being crazy. I thought that was a lot of fun. I wasn't really sure where they were going with the whole collecting the pieces of the relic thing. But when it turned out that the relic's purpose was to reverse Kerrigan's infestation, I just kind of went with it. They were going to have to deal with Kerrigan one way or another. A problem with how Brood War ended was the Dominion and the Protoss were both completely just blown out as a result of it. And also the UED was defeated. So Kerrigan, although she had suffered immense losses, was in a position where she could rebuild for a couple of years and then just overrun everything. So, I don't know, you almost kind of needed some sort of Deus Ex Machina in order to defeat her. And at the time, I was like, okay, well, maybe we'll see. Is there going to be a Kerrigan redemption arc? Is she going to become human again? Is she going to be turned back and find out that she's still evil? And they just completely fucked that up with the sequel, but that's not really this game's fault. The biggest problem with Wings of Liberty is the Zeratul subplot, or the side campaign, which I think was ultimately what ruined StarCraft 2. Don't get me wrong, I still like StarCraft 2. I think there's a lot of good elements to it. I overall enjoy it, and I overall think it is a fairly worthy successor. But my big complaint is the whole Zeratul campaigns making it that the Overmind was the good guy the whole time. Like, the Overmind wasn't evil, the Zerg weren't evil, they were just misunderstood. The Overmind was actually had this 4D chess plan where it was going to make Kerrigan into this, like, it had a vision of the future or something, and Kerrigan was necessary to become a Xel'Naga and to defeat Amon. And in order to carry this out, like it had to do something, and everything the Overmind did was for the greater good. And it's just really lame. Like, one of the things that made the Overmind cool as a villain is that it was completely alien, that it was driven by this desire for evolution, that it did have this kind of sacred purpose to become perfect, and that only by uniting itself and absorbing the Protoss would it become perfect, and it would achieve the fundamental goal for which the Xel'Naga had struggled. And I do like the idea that the Xel'Naga thought the Protoss were too stagnant and unchanging, so they had created the hyper-evolutionary species, but in kind of like a monkey's paw thing or a careful what you wish for thing, the species they created that they sought to that had this desire to perfect itself and to absorb and change, wound up wiping them out, and became just obsessed with it, destroying everything that they came across. And once again, I like that. I like that the Zerg didn't have human morality, that they didn't think the same way humans did, and the kind of the divine mission that the Overmind felt to complete its programming by absorbing the Protoss is something I really enjoyed. And that's all thrown out of the way. The Overmind was actually the good guy. He was a good boy. He didn't do nothing. The Zerg are all innocent. And all that kind of nonsense. And it just kind of ruins a lot of the aspects of the first game. And people might say, okay, but Argent, what about some of this stuff was set up in the first game? The plot for the second game was set up very much in that one side mission in which Zeratul comes across the hybrid. And you aren't going to object to them having hybrids in the sequel, are you? And I mean, no, I'm not, but I kind of feel they screwed the pooch where they just introduced, with a lot of the Xel'Naga stuff they introduced, like the whole infinite cycle thing, and like they harvest, it's kind of like they're like the Reapers now, where the Xel'Naga are the final product of evolution from the previous universe. I like the idea that the Xel'Naga were just an ancient alien species that played God and tried to make like their special creations, and their creations backfired and destroyed them, and kind of like a Dr. Frankenstein type thing. I don't really get what was so wrong with that. I mean, it was fairly obvious that Duran was working for a Xel'Naga, but I kind of would have preferred it if, like, Amon was just omnicidal and his dream was just to exterminate the Protoss and Zerg as kind of revenge for the fall of his people. And that he was just kind of this bitter being that couldn't let go of the past and was just completely consumed by his hatred of everything. Like, I think that would have been kind of a better way to go. I don't know if the Xel'Naga really needed to be made into these transcendent beings. They could have just been really advanced aliens or something like that. So I just felt the whole story kind of went off the rails with that. I don't think it was very good how Amon was handled. I don't think it was good the retcons they did with the Overmind. And kind of the meta plot, I don't think was, like, amazing for StarCraft 2. There's other aspects of Legacy of the Void I like, and I'll do a separate video talking about Legacy of the Void. But I think overall, because this game mostly just focused on Jim and Manx and kind of continuing a lot of the plot threads and themes from the first game, but kind of taking them to the next level and building upon them, it came out pretty solid. And if you don't even... The Zeratul campaign is optional, so if you don't even play it, then you don't have to deal with the shitty retcons. So, on the whole, I'd say Wings of Liberty was definitely really good. Probably one of the best RTSs ever made. If you like the original and you haven't really been sure as to whether or not you want to give StarCraft 2 a try, I'd say definitely give Wings of Liberty a try. If for no other reason than the gameplay, I think is still really fun and really holds up. And there's a lot of enjoyable missions with a lot of variety in them. So that's my review of it and my thoughts on it. I hope you enjoyed it. More videos to come. God bless.